Welcome to FO Podcasts. Professor Haruko Sato from the Osaka School of International Public Policy and Dr. Satu Lamay, Vice President and Research Program Director at the East-West Center in Washington, are with us today. They will discuss the evolving role of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, a strategic partnership between four of the most important democracies in the Indo-Pacific: Japan, the U.S., Australia, and India.
So I basically have two questions today for you.
Okay.
I thought this might be a good opportunity to talk about your article, The Three Body Problems, just to put it out on the air and use that as a way how you look at the U.S.-China relations, how we in Asia perceive that and react to it, and whether there are some gaps or miscommunication, misperception in how we understand the dynamics, and whether perhaps there's a better, perhaps a bandwidth between the U.S. and its Asian partners to compare notes and perhaps think about how to, overall U.S. engagement in Asia. So that's the first question. And then the second one, actually, I just wanted to talk about or ask you about how you think the Quad might move forward. Because Atul and I did two podcasts previously, one with Jae-woo Chu, about seriously adding South Korea and making it the Quad into a sort of a quintet. My question I originally had was, why did we start off with the Quad rather than having South Korea? And there are historical and diplomatic issues involved at the time, which I understand. But I was actually quite taken back when we had that, when I participated in the Quad Fellowship that was sponsored by the State Department, that the wrap-up expansion of the Quad started, or they were thinking of doing it just with Southeast Asia. And I thought that's a bit problematic, particularly if Japan is on board. And so perhaps we are seeing different strategic sort of visions or maps. And I'm not sort of saying that it's a bad idea. Of course, Southeast Asia or ASEAN should be partner to the Quad, but the Quad being Quad with not so much of a coherent identity. And if it is to become functionally useful in areas that, for example, in non-traditional security or infrastructure building, it would have seemed quite natural to have South Korea together with ASEAN. So should we first have your thoughts on your three-body problem?
Sure. Let's start there, and then we can go to the Quad discussion. I wrote the three-body problem because there were three issues that I was trying to think through myself. The first question that I was trying to deal with is, what is the state of U.S. Southeast Asia relations today? Basically circa the fall of 2024. Because in the literature, in the workshop seminar series, in the kind of discourse and narratives around U.S. Southeast Asia, there is a sense that things are going poorly. I would just cite an article in Foreign Affairs published in the last few days called "America is Losing Southeast Asia," a Council on Foreign Relations seminar entitled "Has China Won?" or something along those lines. I cite that particular seminar in the article. So the first issue was, really how bad or how good are Southeast Asia relations? And why are they being framed this way? And of course, this question followed on maybe the 3-4 years preceding it. A number of books, Sebastian Strangio's book, Murray Hebert's book, David Shambau's book, all kind of looking at Southeast Asia and U.S. and thereby U.S. Southeast Asia in the lens or through the lens of the U.S.-China relationship. Either U.S.-China in Southeast Asia or what China was doing in Southeast Asia, but kind of that framework. The second question I was attending to in the three-body problem in U.S.-Southeast Asia relations is, what is the U.S. role and what is Southeast Asia's role in the making of U.S.-Southeast Asia relations? You know, in the United States, we inevitably and naturally focus on what the U.S. is doing, what I've called in the past the supply side of the U.S. relationship. Here are our agenda, here are our policies, here are our instruments, here are our mechanisms, here are our tools, here are our objectives. Great, that to me all perfectly makes sense. But like any relationship, it takes two hands to clap, and I thought we don't get as much about where Southeast Asia plays into this relationship and what kind of, if you will, what is the agency, maneuverability, navigation space for Southeast Asia? What decisions are they making and what's the context in which they have to make them? So that was the second issue that I really wanted to deal with. And the third issue that I really wanted to deal with is this really only about U.S. and China? There's no question that China and U.S.-China loom large. No one can deny that this may be the most important. But being a kind of data wonk and being a little bit of a numbers wonk, I kept looking at the numbers and seeing the remarkable role of Japan, the EU, the Republic of Korea, and just my own kind of analytical assumptions about the way the world operates in an increasingly fragmented, multipolar world. And I thought Southeast Asia's integration patterns are only 25% intra-ASEAN, and the rest are with external players. And it's not all China. I mean, the data clearly demonstrates that it's not all China. And you can, if you take manufactured goods, certainly that is the case. But it's not true with services. It's not true with foreign direct investment. The aid and assistance packages of Japan, Korea, and the EU are massive in Southeast Asia. Australia has important niche roles in particular countries across the region, just marked its 50th anniversary. So that was the third question, is really how important is this framing of U.S.-China? Nobody, and certainly not me, is denying that is a core element. And then I approached it from this slightly whimsical construction because I couldn't think of another way that you wouldn't talk about it. You could have called it multipolarity and U.S.-Southeast Asia relations. Sure. And you could have looked systematically at each country, but I thought that was boring to look at. Oh, here's what Japan is doing. Here's what EU is doing. Here's what ROK is doing. Here's what India is doing. Here's what Australia. You could do it that way too. But I thought, wouldn't it be fun to kind of look at the three things that seem to me to be at the center of Southeast Asia relations today? One is sort of the defense and security realm. The second is the commercial realm, trade, investment, assistance, technical, packaging, supply chains, etc. And the third being kind of this whole multilateral or regionalism project. And then, you know, I happened to be watching the show Three Body Problem, and I thought, how would one apply this to the questions I'm trying to answer? And I didn't think it would work. But I thought, the more I wrote it, I thought, you know, if Southeast Asia is this planet, it gives it agency. There are these three things it's dealing with, these three planets that are that have mass and are exerting gravitational pull. And how does Southeast Asia as a planet navigate these suns, these three suns of defense, security, commerce, trade, investment, etc., and multilateralism, regionalism, order, institutions, norms? And it struck me that it could work, that this framework, while being slightly whimsical and a little bit off script in terms of policy analysis and typical academic approaches, might help us understand what I consider to be answers to those three questions, or at least investigations of those three questions. And I stand by my conclusions, which is that each of these suns has a pretty equal mass defense, security, commerce, and multilateralism, regionalism project. You could call it multilateralism. You could call it groupings. And the point I was simply making is none of those are just U.S.-China. Is U.S.-China a big component of it? Yeah. Is China a big important component on its own? Yes. Is U.S. a component of them? Major, the most important mass in these funds. But so is Japan and EU and ROK and the World Trading Organization system. And, these suns with this mass in each of these topic areas are complicated. They've got lots of stuff going on in the sun. And Southeast Asia can pull and weave and navigate and maneuver amongst them and within them in ways that redound to their interests. And I think that was true. So that answered the question about whether U.S.-Southeast Asia relations were that bad. My conclusion is we're certainly not losing Southeast Asia. And I think U.S.-Southeast Asia relations are certainly not perfect, but they're hardly in crisis. And a number of elements in the piece shows all the things we're doing and all the data that demonstrate that. And thirdly, that Southeast Asia has a lot of agency and a lot of room to maneuver and is making decisions about these outcomes. And that's all I really have to say about the piece is, again, it was a sort of a math problem where you're trying to show your work. And I was, to me, writing the piece was, fundamentally about working out for myself. Did I accept the proposition or the hypothesis that I held that it's more than U.S.-China in Southeast Asia, and it's that U.S. is not losing Southeast Asia, and that Southeast Asia has a very important role and opportunity to play a role within the current international environment in which they find themselves. And those are the answers I came to. And that's kind of my assessment.
I think what you just outlined about the three planets, three suns, I think it also applies not just in terms of the areas, sort of the military security, the commerce, and then the multilateral, but also actually really gravitational pull within the regional countries as well. It's very much, Southeast Asia is very good at playing all of us off in a way.
Absolutely. I mean, they've done this in pre-modern times, pre-modern meaning colonial era. They've done it in the periods way before European colonialism in their own miniature mini-states and principalities and, configurations that they had pre-modern state Southeast Asia. They certainly did it during colonialism, and they've done it during the Cold War and since. Yeah. And these are not countries that do not have experience, capability in navigation. Of course they're pulled and pushed, and of course there are breakdowns in the system. But I think the emerging international order of fragmentation, multipolarity, new kind of mini-lateral configurations that are functionally based and values-based and maybe country-based actually increase the space for Southeast Asia to navigate, not decrease the space for Southeast Asia to navigate.
So do you think then, so while you were in an exercise trying to come up with how do you figure out the state of US ASEAN or Southeast Asia relations, I'm sort of sensing, and this is something perhaps you and I also share just as a generational thing too, but there might be some issues with how the U.S., the policy making within the United States towards Asia, perhaps also might be in a bit of a sclerosis or not being able to, say, do lateral information sharing between different departments. And some are obviously regional, others are issue-based. Because I hear, not recently, but I did hear in the past, say, 7 or 8 years, when you talk to some, say, even European, but Americans about Japan-ASEAN relations, and they're genuinely surprised that the Japan-ASEAN relations are very, very sort of solid. And
Very much.
essentially trusted. And this sort of discovery kind of worries me, because very Japan cultivates a sort of economic and less political, but at least a very sort of economic-based, development-based relationship in the past 40 years with ASEAN. And this surely has to be one of the assets that America should know about, as America's very important ally. And likewise, it goes to South Korea as well. So America's bilateral approach to looking at Southeast Asia and then seeing that within the context or the framework of US-China relations, that's fine, because as you say, it is a very important bilateral relationship. But in terms of judging America's credibility and overall engagement with Southeast Asia, whether it's losing the narrative or not, I think there is a missing sort of component even before the United States comes to its own conclusion. Because if we're allies, then surely the assets of the allies must count. But there are segments of perhaps the US foreign policy community where there is still a knowledge gap about even, Japan's Asia policy overall. So that was something that I'm going to throw back at you and ask whether you sort of sense something like this, or is this something more to do with, say, how the media more simplifies things and manipulates?
So let me make sure I understand the question. The question, if I understand it, is, does the U.S. appreciate Japan-Southeast Asia relations? Or is there something more?
Well, it's not so much.
Not sure what the question is.
So it's really about, yes, in a way, does the U.S. appreciate, say, Japan and Korea's relationship with ASEAN when U.S. is making a pitch or judging its state of affairs with ASEAN? That was what I wanted. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you. That does. I mean, that helps me a little bit, because there was a lot packed into that question. The short answer is very much so. I mean, if you look at, and again, I'm an empiricist, so there's empirical data to show that in the bilateral U.S.-Korea and the U.S.-Japan fact sheet statements, interactions, working together and recognizing each other's interests in and role in Southeast Asia is always mentioned. It's been mentioned for years. I mean, in the case of Japan, it goes back to a deeper era, earlier era, when there was very much an interest in the United States for Japan to play a bigger role in Southeast Asia as post-45, when Japan began to modernize and redevelop and reindustrialize and become a trading nation. And U.S. was important in some of those normalizations with Southeast Asia, the renormalizations with Southeast Asia. In the more modern era, the same is true for Korea. As Korea began to ramp up, as you know, Korea had a new Southern policy that was recognized along with the free and open Indo-Pacific policy as things that could be aligned together. So the short answer is, in both the U.S.-Korea case and the U.S.-Japan case, not only does the U.S. recognize Japan's and Korea's individual roles in the region, but bilaterally wants in both alliances to work together in the region. And more recently, with the roughly over a year-old U.S. ROK Camp David agreements, Southeast Asia is once again part of this firmament of the individual relationships, the bilateral alliances, and now the trilateral. And this is part of the providing public goods, helping to finance infrastructure, coordinating aid policies, deconfliction. Now, having said all of that, I will tell you that I have also heard from Southeast Asian colleagues and friends that, from their perspective, having multiple players, which is one of the key goals of the ASEAN community and Southeast Asian countries, is quite frankly having a constructive, productive competition amongst other partners to provide public goods, to engage, to provide assistance, to work alongside Southeast Asian national interests, is more preferred than, if you will, deconflicting or making too efficient US, Korea, Japan, Australia provision of goods. It's not necessarily in their interest that there be efficiency from the Southeast Asian demand side. So I think we should be careful that we think we're trying to protect Southeast Asian interests by doing US, Japan, and Southeast Asia, US, Korea, and Southeast Asia, US, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. We can overinterpret or overdo that, and Southeast Asians saying, wait a minute, just do what you do individually, and the net plus will be good for you and great for us. And I don't think we should forget that. I don't think we should have any illusions about what the goal is there. As we found out in a very important because it was the first of its kind really done, called the Demand Side for the U.S.-Japan Alliance in Southeast Asia, very helpfully funded by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. We really asked this question. Okay, here's what U.S. and Japan say they're going to do individually and together. What does Southeast Asia make of this? This was a few years ago now, so it needs to be updated. And one of the answers was, don't do everything together. We don't want you to do everything together. So, I think, we're not doing any services to Southeast Asia. I mean, we have to do what U.S. and Japan want to do or U.S. and Korea want to do, of course. But I don't think we should be under any illusions that Southeast Asia wants us to deconflict everything and to have efficiencies of programs. They clearly don't in some cases. They don't mind an aid package coming from Korea or a partnership coming from Japan or from the U.S. and from the EU and from India and from other players that maybe we are not so keen on, Russia or China or whatever. So I think we should be humble and say that we have to do what works for our respective countries. And this is going, I do want to link this to the three-body problem in the sense this is exactly what I'm talking about in the three suns. There are multiple players, and Southeast Asia can navigate amongst multiple players, draw them in, seek to keep them apart, take one thing from another country, take another thing from another country. And in this context, Southeast Asia increases its room for navigation and maneuverability. It's not being pulled at by one sun over another, and it has choices. And it sort of pushes against the notion that Southeast Asia only has two choices and they don't want to choose. Actually, Southeast Asia has multiple choices and they want all of them. That's the real secret, is that the truth is Southeast Asia currently has multiple choices and they love choosing all of them. Arms from Russia, trade with China, some stuff from the United States, some stuff from Japan, some stuff from Australia, Korea, and India. This is the environment they're living in. And I think they're going to see more of that.
Actually, that's very, I now see why you see that perhaps looking at the U.S. Southeast Asia, state of U.S. Southeast Asia relations isn't very useful if you only look at it through the lens of U.S.-China rivalry, because that binary really also doesn't apply to Southeast Asia, right? Southeast Asia has a very flexible, resilient worldview.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And they want that view. They want those opportunities. This is why the Southeast Asian mantra of we don't want to be forced to choose, I think is a little bit of maybe they mean it, we don't want to choose in the U.S.-China context. I understand that. But what I continue to repeat is Southeast Asia has multiple choices and wants to make all of those choices.
I totally agree with you. And I think that's why it's very, as I said, it's very resilient, and how it developed, because the China factor, of course, it looms very big here. I suppose one of the things that at least Northeast Asians, or sort of Japan and South Korea and parts of Southeast Asia worry is some of the very simplistic narrative that goes with looking at, and particularly the military security dimension, having a sort of an overriding drive over, you're talking about Taiwan, talking about the South China Sea, and everything else seems at the moment, at least in some of the international policy talks, that seems to be a very big sort of, not so much of a driver, but at least it seems to be a dominant topic, where here in Asia, there are actually more down-to-earth, work and situations that we want to be addressing, and not seeing everything through, will Taiwan be the next Ukraine?
Right.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
okay, so then should we just speak a bit, just expanding from this three-body and coming back to some reality check about the Quad? We can talk about it in terms of, how should it expand, and also what you see as likely. I don't know if you can predict, but with either the Trump presidency or Harris presidency, and then we can wrap up.
To my mind, there have been really kind of 5 variables that have shaped the evolution of Quad during the past 2 decades. Here we are at the 20th anniversary, right? So over the last 20 years, 5 variables or factors have shaped its evolution. I'm pretty sure, barring any black swans, the major unpredictable developments, that those same 5 factors are going to determine it in the years ahead. The first, of course, is simply the commitment of the 4 parties to the Quad. And as you know, the Quad arose in 2004 as a response to the humanitarian assistance, disaster relief necessity of the tsunami. By 2014, it had really reposed, as I put it, because it had ceased to become very active for lots of reasons that we all know, concerns about China, Australia's concerns. It was revived in 2017, and in 2024, the 20th anniversary year, it's very much revived and active, and they're getting ready to meet in Delaware with President Biden, replacing India as the host this year just because and India will host it next year. In 2034, meaning 10 years from now, I think, it will remain as relevant with its revival now. I can't see it moving, but I would note that all these countries are having political elections. Thankfully, they're democratic countries. They're having elections. Leaders will change. I think there are 9 candidates for the LDP Secretary General race in Japan. The United States, we are having our own election here shortly. Australia will have to have one next year. India has a reduced majority Modi government, but, who knows? In 10 years' time, there may be multiple governments in all of these places, obviously. The second factor is public goods focus and delivery. And in 2004, that public goods focus was exceptional. If you think about it, the earthquake and the tsunami made an exceptional public goods required. In the 2010s, it was not active for the reasons we've talked about. And in the 2017, current 2024 span, there's been very much an expanded public goods agenda. And I do have a certain degree of worry that there's excessive expansion and diffusion of the public goods agenda. Too many things on the docket and not sufficient or optimal delivery. And I continue to worry about that. And I think going forward in the next 10 years, we have to modify that and be careful about calibrating and managing the agenda, the scope, the delivery. The third is the PRC. This sounds like ancient history in these 20 years, but the PRC was not a driver for the 2004 Quad. I mean, no one said, China's aggressive, we need a Quad. They responded to a humanitarian assistance in the middle of Christmas vacation. 9/11 and the Iraq war, global war on terrorism was not strategic distrust was clearly emerging, but it wasn't dominant. Alignment between these 4 countries was possible, but not really particularly high on the agenda because these countries were clearly not completely aligned on how to deal with China and how much threat China posed during this period. Again, it sounds like ancient history, but there was a time when we talked about a G2, and Japan and Australia and India were worried about a G2 in 2008, 2010. And after 2010, that began to go away. And that was one of the things that clearly broke apart the Quad in the 2010s, right? It wasn't a sufficient driver. Strategic distrust was not sticking. There was clearly not full alignment. Well, by 2024, where we are today, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, China has become a key driver of the Quad. There's increasing strategic competition, which is most importantly equally or roughly equally shared by all four partners. And it begs the question, is this peak alignment on the China issue? How much room is there in the future? And I think my own sense is that China is likely to continue to remain a driver for the Quad. I think sticky strategic competition is here to stay. And I think there'll be, fairly significant alignment on this factor. The final thing is Indo-Pacific. Final two things are Indo-Pacific priority. I mean, we've, ebbed and flowed on Indo-Pacific priority. I think we're quite high on it now. In 10 years, I think we'll remain high on Indo-Pacific priority. But let's see. Let's wait. 10 years is a long time, and things change as they've changed in the past 10 years, as we've talked about. And finally, I think alliances and multilateralism amidst globalization and de-risking is another variable. And I think what we're seeing now is a breakdown of sort of big ambitions for global governance and Indo-Pacific regional governance, and the emergence of these kind of mini-lateral wires that connect wheels and alliances more strongly. So, U.S.-Japan ROK, Quad, AUKUS, Minerals Security Partnership, semiconductor partnerships with the Dutch, the Japanese, and the Americans, for example. So I think these mini-lateral wires will also affect the Quad's future in the next 10 years. So I think that's my forecast. I think there are these 5 variables that I've kind of tried to isolate to make it easier to kind of think through what has been and what might come. And then, of course, there are the issues pending. I mean, one is securitization, how much to securitize the Quad. Second is how much to institutionalize the Quad. Does it need a secretariat and a building, or just how much? Operationalizing the Quad, really providing those public goods that we've talked about. I think there's a question about integrating the Quad, not only with other organizations, groupings in the region, but also amongst the 4 partners. How does IMUSHO deal with State Department, deal with DFAT, deal with Ministry of External Affairs of India, for example, on a particular issue? And then I think this regional public goods role remains as important as ever, and probably the litmus test of whether people in the region think the Quad is important and useful. So let me stop there.
No, I've actually never really thought of the Quad from its very inception to this sort of changes actually. But I'd like to, I've sort of floated the idea that perhaps Quad needs to sort of expand a bit. But in this functional sphere, and if it's going to be just a sort of the cornerstone of how, as you say, the alliances and of de-risking in the future is going to take place, I suppose it really doesn't matter who comes in or not. Rather, it's more to do with having it spread its sort of tentacles or legs functionally. So if you think that the PRC is going to still be quite the driver, do you see any sort of changes in the strategic competition, or is it going to be, if not intensified, but just sizzling for the next 10 years? Is there a way that the Quad countries could be instrumental in changing the paradigm a bit? Do you see any function, or that's a different sort of dynamic altogether?
I think that's a great question. I obviously wish I knew the answer. I have no idea what the answer is. I do not see much prospect for the strategic competition. I think it can be more or less managed, less or more hot or cold on a spectrum, yada, yada. But I think, part of this answer lies in Beijing. like many things, some of this stuff is made in Beijing. I mean, countries want to cooperate because they're worried about China's behavior. They're not doing this to have additional meetings. They're not doing it because they think it's helpful. But I think some countries are trying to do things together, Vietnam and Philippines, US-Japan ROK, partly because China is creating an environment of uncertainty and aggression and assertiveness that is worrying these countries. And I mean, as much as it depends on the China factor, this is really a question that should be posed to Beijing is, are you going to do things that make things like Quad and AUKUS and US-Japan ROK less attractive?
No, I mean, I think that is everybody's sort of big question, including, I would imagine, in some quarters in Beijing as well. I'm not here to talk about China per se, but
Let's not.
No, let's not.
And thank you so much. Great to see you. I can't believe that we're like 7 hours apart here from Singapore and Tokyo, but definitely let's catch up in 2025 after our crazy elections are over.
Definitely. We'll probably have to do another podcast with you once we know who the president's going to be.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do. Ciao. Bye.
Oh, bye. Thank you.